Dudley Kirk was born in 1914 and grew up in Claremont, California. He graduated from Claremont High School in 1930 and completed his undergraduate degree at Pomona College in 1934 during the depths of the Great Depression. Moving to the East Coast, he earned a master's degree from Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University in 1935 and a PhD in sociology from Harvard in 1938. He began his academic career at Princeton, where his collaboration with other pioneering demographers, including Frank Notstein, Kingsley Davis, and Wilbert Moore, helped to shape his ideas about population change. In 1947, at the age of 33, he became the first intelligence official specializing in population issues at the U.S. State Department. 7 years later, in 1954, he joined the Population Council in New York as demographic director. In following years, he published key contributions to the literature on the demographic transition. From 1967 onward, he was a member of the sociology department at Stanford and chaired the department in 1975 to 76, after which he retired from active teaching, but remained active in research. This summary review article appeared in the British journal Population Studies 17 years after he retired from the Stanford faculty and 4 years before his death in 2000. In it, Kirk sketches a wide-ranging summary of the history of demographic transition theory as developed by himself and a number of his colleagues.
As the end of the 20th century approached, the prestigious British journal Population Studies celebrated its 50th year of publication. One way that the editors decided to commemorate the anniversary was to ask Dudley Kirk, one of the founders of demographic transition theory during his early years at Princeton, to write a review article summarizing how this subject had evolved over the course of the century. The demographic aspect of this transition is quite simple, as already sketched by Kingsley Davis decades earlier. The two components of change are mortality decline and fertility decline, as countries transition from an earlier state of high birth and death rates to a final state of low birth and death rates. At either end of the transition, the difference between these vital rates is assumed to be small, so that population grows only slowly, if at all. But during the transition from high to low rates, death rates often fall before birth rates, as they did in Japan. And during that gap between the rates, population can grow very rapidly. This simple picture is the essence of the demographic transition. It is worth noting that this standard version of the theory deals with only two of the three components of population growth, and that transition scholars usually have little or nothing to say about migration patterns. Kirk starts his retrospective with what we usually recognize as the first forerunner of actual transition theory, an article published in the American Journal of Sociology in 1929 by Warren S. Thompson on population. Although he included a lot of predictions that didn't really pan out during the rest of the century, Thompson did provide a valuable description of three groups of countries. In Group A, he included most of the countries in Western Europe. These were countries with low rates of both births and deaths. In fact, Thompson expressed a lot of concern that birth rates were so low that many of these countries would soon start losing population, a fear that has returned among some people now in the early 21st century again. In Group B, he combined most of the countries in Eastern Europe, where he pointed out that although these countries enjoyed low death rates, their birth rates in many cases were quite a bit higher than the death rates, so that these populations were growing quite robustly. Finally, in Group C, Thompson included Japan, Russia, and India, all with both birth and death rates that were still rather high. These were the only other countries outside Europe for which he could find reliable data on populations, birth rates, and death rates at the time he was writing nearly a century ago. He took these three as representative of the entire rest of the world and predicted that because of its massive land area, Russia would be the one country to experience rapid, massive population growth during the rest of the century once its death rate began to decline. This early typology of three groups of countries does not actually link the groups together or suggest that they represent successive stages of some underlying process, but they do offer snapshots of the beginning, middle, and end of what would eventually become the image of demographic transition. In France, the crusading Corsican politician Adolphe Landry managed to find time late in his political career to add a book on demography to his earlier works in economics. Landry was one of the founders of demographic research in France. His 1934 book on what he called the demographic revolution is the earliest actual picture of a process change from high birth and death rates to low birth and death rates, complete with the idea that in the middle, when death rates decline first and birth rates are still high, the population grows much faster than normally. He also linked the entire process of transition to the underlying modernization of society, particularly to urbanization and industrialization that were transforming the Western world at the time. Writing during the Great Global Depression of the early 20th century, he also saw the end result of this process as a threat for the most developed countries. Like Thompson, he feared that birth rates might fall so low that France could face depopulation. And acting on his fears, Landry was one of the leaders in efforts to provide incentives for French families to have more babies and help French society and culture from disappearing. Both he and Thompson were projecting the previous declines in birth rates as a straight line into the future, which of course would have meant the extinction of births, families, and the populations of the developed countries. Both of them must have been quite surprised by the baby boom that followed World War II. Kirk's summary article then turns to the real question behind transition theory. What causes this transition process to begin? Although Kingsley Davis explicitly connected mortality decline to fertility decline and suggested that the falling death rates played a key role in causing falling birth rates later on, he didn't seem to feel any need to explain the falling death rates. Apparently, this is just what death rates are supposed to do. And after all, the mortality decline is part of the demographic transition itself, so it can't really serve as the explanation for why the process gets started. A process that causes itself is not a very good logical construct. A few years later, after World War II finally came to a close, the gang of demographers at Princeton, including Kirk himself, poured out a flood of new books and articles in which what we think of now as the classical form of demographic transition theory first emerged in its full, complete shape. In 1946, Frank Notestein published a book that staked out a strong claim that the demographic transition was caused by a larger process of social change that included expansion of urban manufacturing occupations, the growth of cities, and a new, more prosperous way of life. In fact, there is a strong echo in this classical transition theory, if you listen for it, of Malthus's vision of capitalism and its conveniences of life as a check to population growth. Not only does the prosperity of urban industrial life finally give people control over the scourge of mortality, but it changes the way people view themselves and each other and introduces a whole new logic or rationality about reproductive decisions. Notestein picked up on the thesis of many other early 20th century social scientists and suggested that in modern urban industrial settings, individual people were set free from traditional social roles and rules and began to look at all their options and decisions in terms of what was actually in it, materially speaking, for themselves. He certainly did not come up himself with this idea of newly autonomous individuals. When he wrote about people making rational choices based on what would be most profitable for themselves on an individualized basis, he also was just borrowing a popular idea at the time. But this idea fit pretty well as a possible explanation for why people might begin to marry later and have fewer children. At least that was the way that Notestein and his Princeton colleagues looked at it. 25 years later, the Princeton gang was still singing pretty much the same song. Economic development and rising prosperity caused the demographic transition. This is easy to explain when it comes to death rates, because everybody is against death, and as soon as any society can afford to, it will start cleaning up the causes of a high death rate. Falling birth rates are a little trickier, though, and it is not enough just to point to urban industrial society as the cause. After all, as Malthus pointed out back in 1798, if you just increase the food supply, people could just multiply right up to the new limit. The real culprit when it comes to falling birth rates was more subjective and psychological, according to these Princeton scholars. In 1973, for example, Ansley Cole gave a famous update to this subjective psychological aspect of fertility decline. He famously suggested that 3 things had to be true before people would start to limit the number of children they produced. First, this question of the number of children had to be something that people see as optional or discretionary. That is, they can choose or not choose to have children. If children are non-negotiable and the only way to be treated as an adult is to produce some of them, then Cole would say that children are not within the calculus of conscious choice. This is the same materially rational choice idea that Notstein had mentioned earlier. Cole also added that when people were weighing the option of children in this cool, calculating fashion, they had to decide that it might be advantageous not to have that birth, or at least to have a lot fewer births and to have them later in life. And finally, of course, it had to be possible to act on such a rational decision. The means to avoid a birth had to exist. By this, of course, Cole meant contraceptives or some other means of avoiding births, but still managing to have a sex life. Like Malthus and like Botero before him, Cole and the other 20th century demographers recognized that we are all as apt for generation today as we were 2,000 or 4,000 years ago. Demographic transition theory took hold in the second half of the 20th century. Economists in particular jumped on the bandwagon and began to develop more complex and sophisticated extensions of the basic thesis. Kirk reviews several different varieties of these economic theories, which were basically theories of fertility and fertility decline. Economists didn't feel much of a need to use economic models to explain falling death rates. One of the most prominent milestones in this economic theorizing came in the 1960s when Gary Becker set out what became known as the New Household Economics. Becker wanted to use economic language and models that had been used for explaining banking and manufacturing and other aspects of the economy and apply them to new aspects of life that people were not used to thinking about in such terms. As Kirk points out, this represented the invasion of rational choice theory into areas that had been seen up to that point as governed by entirely different principles such as customs and traditions. In a famous article, Becker suggested that we might think about babies as consumer durables. In the language of economics, there are 2 types of goods or products: producer goods and consumer goods. A producer good is anything that people use to produce other products. For example, a hammer is a producer good. Carpenters buy hammers and use them to build houses for people to live in. A consumer good is anything that people consume directly rather than using to produce other things. For example, a hamburger is an obvious consumer good because we literally consume it. So when Becker calls babies consumer durables, what could he have meant? We don't eat babies, at least we're not supposed to, despite the modest proposal written by Jonathan Swift, where he suggested this as a solution to both overpopulation and hunger. Calling a baby a consumer good actually gets a little metaphysical here, because Becker claims that we consume the services of babies by enjoying them, playing with them, being proud of them, and so on. He doesn't mention changing their diapers or listening to them crying or watching them grow into teenagers who shout, "I hate you," in your face. Babies apparently should be seen as a source of what economists like to call utility. That is, we get some kind of satisfaction just from producing them and having them around. But what about the durable part of consumer durables? Consumer goods themselves come in 2 forms, durable and non-durable. A refrigerator is a durable good. We expect it to last 20 years when we buy it. On the other hand, a roll of toilet paper is a non-durable good. We expect to see the end of the roll before too long as it gradually gets consumed. A baby is clearly a durable good because babies don't get used up for a long time. In fact, some of them may be around pretty much forever. There was only one problem with Becker's description of babies as consumer durables. When we look at other kinds of goods that people acquire, one of the basic axioms of economic theory predicts that people with more income demand more commodities. This produces the famous and well-known positive demand curve that figures in the dreams and nightmares of every student in introductory economics courses. People with more money buy more cars, more airplanes, more boats, more clothes, more vacations, houses with more rooms, and pretty much more of everything except babies. As we know, the rich get richer and the poor get babies. Why don't rich people have more children than poor people? They certainly could afford more children, and if children are an automatic source of satisfaction and utility, that's what should happen. This problem drove economists crazy for several years, so they immediately began spinning out more and more complicated theories and explanations for why the basic rule of the positive demand curve did not predict how many babies people would have. As they developed all these variations on a theme by Becker, though, there is one possible explanation that you will never ever find in any of these economic theories. This idea apparently was so distasteful that it was treated as a taboo subject that would never be brought up or discussed. This is the idea of children as inferior goods. An inferior good is something that you buy because you're too poor to afford the real thing, whatever that might be. For example, if you can't afford a nice house, you buy a nice car instead. If you can't afford a Ferrari, you buy a Corvette. If you can't afford a Corvette, you buy a Dodge Neon. If you can't afford filet mignon, you buy a Big Mac. Maybe children are what people get for themselves when they can't afford anything else. But this idea seems to have horrified every single economist enough that it never shows up in their theories. Instead, they went for all kinds of fancy explanations of why rich people might have fewer children than poor people. One of the favorites was the price effect argument that rich people can't afford to have lots of children because each rich kid is so expensive to bring up. To replace yourself with a child who grows up to take your place at the poverty line doesn't take much in the way of resources. But to replace yourself at the top of the social pyramid might take a lot. You have to buy polo ponies and pay for private schools that cost as much in kindergarten as they do for college. But this price effect argument never panned out too well because it turns out that most studies find that incomes rise much faster than the direct expenses of raising children. So the facts are just not there to support this explanation. A better supported explanation stresses opportunity costs of children. An opportunity cost is whatever you give up when you make some choice for yourself. Getting up to go to class costs you additional hours of sleep. Paying your rent and your electric bill may use up the money you would have used to buy your blood pressure medicine. People who have children are giving up the options of what they might have been doing besides taking care of those children, particularly career opportunities that they may lose, but also additional consumer goods that they no longer can afford. Opportunity costs are the contemporary name for exactly what Malthus was talking about when he suggested that people would choose the conveniences of life instead of more babies. If women postpone or avoid births because they have careers, those careers can be seen as both sources of satisfaction in themselves and paths to even more consumer goods down the road. And since rich people have more opportunities than poor people, they also obviously have more opportunity costs to give up if they choose babies. That could be why they don't choose babies as often. If we're not careful, though, this logic could bring us back to the inferior good argument, so watch your step here, economists. Another version of the economic logic of falling birth rates takes a little wider view of the situation, recognizing that individuals don't actually live in a vacuum. They usually live in family households instead. And the trouble with being human is that we're all temporary. We're born, we grow up, we get old, and then we die. And at the beginning and at the end, we are consumers without being much as producers. One of the age-old reasons that people often give for having children, if you bother to ask them, is to produce somebody who will still be reasonably young when you get old and frail. Somebody who will be around to help you get dressed or take you to the doctor, or maybe just sit at the dinner table with you sometimes and have a talk. People have children for old age security. More children would mean more security when you get old. But if we put this idea into the picture drawn by Notstein and others, a picture of the society with rising wealth, highly mobile urban lifestyles, and new mechanisms like pensions and Social Security for guaranteeing comfort and safety in old age, this urban industrial transformation might cut the ground from under children as old age security. For one thing, you might have other sources of security and not need to depend on your children to take care of you. For another, they might not be available because they might live on the other side of the country or even the planet. To the extent that family obligations are replaced by government programs and private pensions, people might feel less need to have children for old age security, and this might lead to fewer births. Kirk presents several other refinements and variations on this central economic explanation for fertility decline, but these represent the main lines of the argument. With this in mind, let us move on to consider the other alternative explanations that he explores. Versions of economic explanations, Dudley Kirk's article reviews another modification of classical transition theory proposed by Jack Caldwell of the Australian National University. Caldwell's reformulation has a lot in common with the economic arguments advanced by previous scholars, but it was new and different in one important way. As Ansley Cole had suggested, if people are making carefully considered choices based on their own interests, this will only lower birth rates if people decide that more children are not in their best interest. But virtually all the early writers who offered economic explanations for fertility decline just assumed that it would be obvious to anybody that too many children would cause economic problems. People should always choose fewer children in order to enjoy more alternatives, more conveniences of life. Malthus would have been very proud of them. With saying that small families are the obvious rational choice is that there are all those countries that still have high birth rates and large families. People offering the economic explanation for fertility decline were forced to conclude that in some sense, people in those traditional cultures were not being rational. Sometimes they describe this as being traditional instead of rational, which seems to say that tradition themselves must be irrational. This opposition between traditional and rational ways of thinking is what Ansley Cole accepted when he talked about reproductive decisions as falling outside the calculus of conscious choice. If people did not make a choice to have a small family, they must not be thinking carefully about it. Must not be rational. Maybe they were just being traditional instead. Caldwell had no use at all for this opposition between traditional and rational. It made traditional cultures look stupid, ignorant, and wrong-headed, like an involuntary addiction to having too many children. After years of first-hand fieldwork in Africa and Southeast Asia, Caldwell was convinced that all people everywhere think pretty much the same way about their lives, and that everybody always tries to make rational decisions. The problem, he said, was not in the minds of the people in those traditional cultures, but in the minds of the economists who had been publishing theories to explain the transition. His solution was to expand our perspective on the conditions within which people lived and made their choices about how many children to have. He argued that the consumer durables perspective suggested by Gary Becker and all the people who followed him was too narrow. Children in Chicago or New York or London might be consumer durables, but in Calcutta or Cairo, children were actually what the economists should have recognized as producer goods, not consumer goods. Caldwell's way of saying this involved what he called wealth flows. In traditional societies, Caldwell had seen that parents continued to control the lives of their children well into adulthood. If children grew up and became productive adults, their respect and obedience toward their parents meant that wealth flowed from those children to their parents. The more children you had in such a culture, the richer you would become. Children were not expensive liabilities. They were valuable, productive assets. When he put it this way, Caldwell was able to argue that all people in all cultures are basically rational, making decisions about large families in their own interest in some cases, and about small families that were in their own interest in other cases. He still held on to the classical transition emphasis on the urban industrial transformation of society, on rising standards of living as the motor of the transition, but he threw out the opposition between traditional and rational. Everybody was now rational. The difference between high fertility and low fertility was not reasonableness or enlightenment, but wealth flows. If children stopped being valuable assets and instead became expensive liabilities, if the wealth flows from parents to children instead of from children to parents, then it becomes rational to have small families instead of large families. In fact, maybe it becomes rational not to have any children at all, and to let somebody else's children take care of you when you get old. Tom Espenshade produced a famous estimate that in the United States, each child that you have will cost you the cash price of a new house that you will never see. Poor people give up one modest poor people house for each child they have. Rich people give up one McMansion for each child they have. This is one of the opportunity costs of having that child. But this is only true in a place like the United States, where wealth flows from parents to children instead of the other way around as it used to do in traditional societies. So what is it that reverses the flow of wealth across family generations? Was it the urban industrial revolution? That was the explanation of classical transition theory. When historians started looking at the details, though, they didn't find what they were expecting. The industrial factory system that appeared in early industrial cities, pretty much everywhere this happened in the world, usually operated on what was called the family system. This sounds nice, but it was a hard life. The whole family would get up in the morning and all walk together down through the factory gates. Mom and Dad and all the boys and girls would all go to their various workplaces in the factory and work all day, every day. At the end of the week, Dad got a paycheck, including the pay for everybody in his family. If he was a good dad, they all got food and clothes and fuel for the stove. If he was a drunk, the whole family might go cold and hungry. Obviously, the family system of factory work continued the flow of wealth from children to parents. It continued the incentive for large families and high birth rates. This does not sound like an explanation for fertility decline. The children are still producer goods, not consumer durables. To understand what reversed the wealth flow and turned children into expensive liabilities, we have to look not at economic but at political changes. In the United States, for example, the birth rate started to fall rapidly only after the federal government outlawed child labor and mandated formal schooling for children starting in the early decades of the 20th century. It was not factory employment, but rather government laws that reversed the flow of wealth across family generations. We are so used to this situation in the United States today that we take it for granted that children are expensive liabilities, not sources of wealth. Certainly the early economic theories of the demographic transition all assumed this. That is why Gary Becker found it so natural to think of children as consumer durables. It probably never occurred to him to consider that they might be producer goods instead. Today it seems perfectly normal and natural that wealth should flow from parents to children, and many people have never even considered any alternative possibility. Of course, in this kind of situation, it should not be a surprise to anybody if couples take a long, hard look at their situation and make a rational choice to postpone children, or maybe even to pass up the whole idea of parenthood. But this is still an economic theory for explaining the demographic transition. We are still talking about people making essentially economic choices in order to get the best economic results for themselves that they can manage. And the changes in society that reverse wealth flows and modify their calculations in favor of small families are changes that took place within that society itself, changes that evolved and developed according to their own internal dynamic. Malthus might say it was capitalism. Notstein might say it was industrialization, but it is always viewed as a process unfolding within the society itself. Kirk's review turns to one final kind of explanation for the transition, however, that departs radically from the conventional picture of economic change unfolding within the society itself. This is the idea of cultural borrowing or diffusion. New ideas, new ways of living don't always just evolve in a society as though it were a sealed test tube. Sometimes new ideas and practices suddenly intrude into a society as a result of contact with and borrowing from some other part of the world. The classic example of this kind of diffusion could be the dragons carved on some Mayan temples in Central America. Archaeologists have traced the prehistoric architecture of the Mayans carefully over the centuries and were startled to discover that after hundreds of years with no trace of any dragons anywhere, suddenly a lot of dragon carvings started showing up on statues and reliefs and other artwork. This can't be the result of some kind of internal development because there are no such things as real dragons to model for such carvings. The most likely explanation is that one day, one or more Chinese junks suddenly sailed up to the Pacific coast of Central America, and some Chinese sailors got out and diffused some of their Chinese culture amongst the Mayans. Next thing you know, the Mayans suddenly were carving dragons on things. Dragons that look an awful lot like the dragons that the Chinese had been carving for centuries. This may be a pretty obscure example, but what can happen with dragons could also happen with small families and the timing of births. Reproductive practices might diffuse from one society to another just as easily as rap music or Hollywood movies or pizza. This was what Karen Oppenheim Mason was talking about when she said that once one country in a region got started with fertility decline, other countries could quickly follow in their footsteps. Like all explanations, of course, diffusion and borrowing raises new questions of its own. Can small families and low birth rates really just be borrowed from one society to the next? Under what circumstances do such new ideas catch on? And in what other situations do traditional ways of life persist, with wealth flowing from children to parents instead? There are still plenty of questions for people to look into after they finish reading Dudley Kirk's article.